All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's studio review. This week we are doing Studio 5, and this week's topic is actually a pretty important one, and also a pretty dense topic. There's a lot of new kind of ideas coming at you. This week we're going to be talking about methods. So specifically, we're interested in how to write methods and what the different parts of methods are. We'll get a chance to review all of that as we go through the studio today. We're also going to talk about testing and how we can make sure that the methods are behaving the way that we expect them to behave. So let's go ahead and dive right in. We're going to have you write a few methods today, starting with this one. We're going to write a method called distance between. So let's take a look at that file in the studio, and here's distance between right up top. We can see that it's already been started for us, but it's a good chance to review the parts of a method. We have these two words out front, public and static. We're going to treat those as kind of still magic, hocus pocus, abracadabra words for now, but we are getting closer to explaining what these do in more detail. This is the return type. So this is specifying what the output of the method is going to be. This method is going to output a double. So it's going to output something with a decimal value. This is the name of the method. And this is important because it describes what the method does, but it's also how we are going to refer to this method, how we're going to call this method when we want to use it a little bit later on. And then inside of the parentheses, we see that we have four parameters. These are inputs into our method. So they're separated by commas, and you can see that these are all doubles. They're going to represent the x and y coordinates of the points that we wish to find the distance between. So it's up to us to do the math here. You can see that right now it's just setting this value to be 0. And then this statement here says that whatever this value is our answer. So basically we're saying that the distance is always going to be 0. Well, that's not true. We actually need to replace this 0 with the actual arithmetic that's involved. And I'm going to Google the distance formula because even though I've done it many times, it's still nice to just refresh, make sure that I'm doing this properly. X2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. All right, let's do that. We should be able to do that. We're going to do math.pow for the squaring part. So it'll be x2 minus x1. And we want that to be taken to the second power. From there, we wish to add the same term, but with the y values. So let's go ahead and just reuse this little chunk of code here and switch the x's to y's. And then last, we need to take the square root of that entire thing. So I'll type in math.square root and put the oops, why did you do that? And put the parentheses around this entire thing with a semicolon at the end, and that should compute the distance formula for us. But how do we know? How do we know that's actually going to work? Well, this leads us to the other major part of today's studio, which is that we have something called tests. We have unit tests that are written to test our code. And so the studio instructions ask you to take a look at the tests and then run them. We can actually, let's just go ahead and run them first, and we'll take a look at them just a little bit later. I'm going to run them by right-clicking this method test suite and running it as JUnitTest. All right, and once we do this, it's going to run a bunch of tests for us. We're actually only interested in these tests because these are for other methods that we haven't gotten to yet. So these down here, we'll hopefully fix those once we get to that part of the studio. Right now, we're just looking at the distance between tests because we're working on the distance between method. And you can see that a lot of these have green check marks. That means the tests pass. There's one here, though, that has a blue X on it, which means that it didn't pass. It failed. So let's take a look at this test and try and see a little bit about how tests work, but also, take a look, and we see right up here there's a comment that actually there's a mistake here. So, this was somewhat of an intentional thing for you to come and find and fix. This is trying to test the distance between the points of 0, 0 and 30, 40. But if we look at how this test is actually used, notice this right here, methods.distanceBetween. If we take a look right? It says 0, 30, 0, 40. So this is x1, y1, x2, y2. But if we go back to our method as it's defined, I'm sorry, is that correct? I'm sorry, it's x, hmm. This is x1, x2, y1, y2, right? x1, so it's both of the x coordinates followed by both of the y coordinates. But if we look at the way that the method is declared over here, we can see that it goes x1, y1, x2, y2. And that order matters. These parameters do need to show up in exactly the same order as the way the method is defined. So this should be fixable just by switching these around. And once we do that, we can run this again and see that hopefully this time our tests are going to pass. And we see that all of these have green check marks. That means that all of the tests pass. But what does it actually mean for the test to pass? Let's take a moment and talk about that. We see that there's really only one thing happening in each one of these tests. It just says assert equals, assert equals, assert equals. So if we take a look at some of these simple ones up here, the distance between 1, 0, and 2, 0 is about 1. Well, what's actually happening? It's using our method to compute the distance using the distance formula. This is what we expect the answer to be. So we've chosen these points specifically because we know the answer is 1. So we say, hey, run this method, make sure that it gives you back a value of 1, and then this last term over here is what we would call the tolerance, basically saying that we're allowed to be off by that amount and still have it be considered. If it's not exactly 1, that's okay as long as it's within this range of the number 1. That's actually important. A lot of computations cannot be accurately done exactly, so that tolerance actually matters for us. And all of these tests behave similarly. So the one that we fixed down here, we see that it has 50 as the distance between 0, 0 and 30, 40, right? But it wasn't going to compute that since the parameters were input in the improper order. It was computing the distance between two different points than the ones that we were intending to compute the distance between. And this is actually a very important point to illustrate. These unit tests, right, we're using these to tell us whether our code is correct or not. But these tests are written by people a lot of the times, and they're going to have mistakes. These are also code, right? So any piece of code can have a mistake in it. That is just a fact. People are in charge of things. People make mistakes. So any piece of code that you see, it's possible for mistakes to be in there. In fact, a good experienced programmer will kind of just assume that there are mistakes in the code that we just haven't found, we haven't thought about yet necessarily, and need to be found and fixed. It's very, 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 very difficult to eliminate all mistakes from a piece of code, especially if it's a complicated piece of code. You can think that there's a lot of different potential ways that that code could run. Anything involving numbers, I mean, there's potentially infinite number of possibilities since numbers can run to infinity. So, testing, while very important, is also kind of tricky. We want to try and test as much as possible, but it can be difficult to conceive of testing all possible outcomes. And we have to deal with the fact that humans are involved as well, and we make mistakes. One analogy that I like to make is if you take a test in this class or any class, for example, and you ace it, you get 100% on that test. Does that mean that you know everything there is to know about the topics that were presented on that test? I think most people would think about this for a second and be like, well, no, it just means that I know the stuff that is on the test. There could be other things about that topic that weren't on the test that I don't know about yet. And the same is true here, right? These tests are only as good as the things that they are testing. If there are other things that we're not checking for, then we won't necessarily know if the code's working properly or not. So writing lots of tests, it turns out, is actually an important part of programming. It's something that we care about very much. We wish to know that our code is working properly, and the way to do that is to write unit tests to check our code. So let's keep moving with the studio after that little tangent there. We're going to Studio asks you to write another test for distance between. We can do that. We can make a test called test points E, and probably the best way to do that is just go ahead and copy this big old chunk, redo this, change the name to E, and then, we don't need these comments anymore. We can get rid of those. But we do need to change the numbers. So if we wish to write a test between 8, 9, and 5, 5, we need to change the numbers to say that the result should be about 5. This needs to become 8, 9, and 5, 5 was the other coordinate that we're looking at. So 5, 5. And after we save this, we can run our tests once more, and we'll actually see this time that we have an additional test down here called test points E. That's the one that we just wrote, and it passes. So it's also able to properly compute the distance between these 2 points. In a professional environment, we would keep going. This is not enough tests. We would keep writing tests until we're really sure this code's going to work properly. But we're going to move on to the next part of the studio, which is involving some drawing. We're going to write a method that draws bullseyes on the screen. So we want to be able to draw not just one big bullseye like this, although that is something we want to do, but I want to be able to draw this bullseye in many different places with many different sizes. And you can think that there's, very much a way that we can do that. I think the code to do that's not too tricky. However, how can we do that in a nice, clean, straightforward kind of fashion, a reusable way? Let's take a look at the code that's been provided for this particular method. I need to switch back to the methods file here. It's right down here. Here's draw bullseye. Actually, we can see that some of it's been provided for us. It sets the pen color to black, and it draws a bullseye, but where is it actually drawing that? Well, we can see we have 2 parameters given to us, and the comments up here tell us what these parameters represent. X and Y represent the center coordinate of the bullseye, and then this represents the radius of the bullseye, the size of the full circle. So we can see the outer circle is black, and then it looks like there's a blue circle on top of it, and a red circle on top of that, and a yellow circle on top of that. If we actually want to see what this code does, we can run this debug application, which will draw a bunch of bullseyes for us. I'll show you what that looks like. So here's what it looks like before we make any changes, right? You can see it just has the black circle. It doesn't have the inner parts, the other circles, but we're going to fix that. You can see that the method can be used to draw lots of bullseyes around the screen, though. Let's see if we can get those other circles in. The next circle was blue. It gives us some RGB values here. You can also just, you don't have to use the exact colors. But as a little refresher, to make a color, we first have to declare a variable for that color and then say new color 0, 109, 219. Do we need to import this probably? Yeah, let's import that. All right, and now we can call standard draw to set the pen color to that color. And then finally, we can draw our circle. We know actually that the blue, just by looking at the picture, right, it's going to have the same center point. So this blue circle has the same center as the black circle does. It's just the radius is shorter. So we need to compute the radius based on the radius of our black circle, right? We can see here that the blue ring has 3/4 the radius of the black one. So let's draw a filled circle at x, y with 3/4 the radius. And after I write this chunk, I'm going to run the debug app again and see if I notice any changes. Okay, there's our blue circle. If we progress along, you can see that blue circle appears on all of them, so that's kind of cool. Let's do this for the last 2 circles to complete the bullseye. I'm just going to copy this code a couple more times here and modify the colors to say 146, 0, 0. This is going to be called red. Oops, I did not mean to have that in all caps. This radius will be 1/2, so we'll say 1 divided by 2. And then this color, which we're calling yellow, we'll have 255, 255, 109. We'll plug yellow in here, and then make this 1/4 of the radius. All right, let's run this debug app one more time and make sure we can see. There's our completed bullseye. And if we keep going, we can see, hey, look, it works if I shrink the radius of all the other ones shrink as well because we computed them relative to the biggest radius. So that's kind of nice. Even if I shrink it down real small, I can even do multiple on the screen at once. That's great. Another thing to keep in mind about this method, take a look at the return type. The return type is void. That means that there is no output of this method. Notice that we don't have any unit tests for this method. The way that we have to verify void methods is to visually inspect them. So void methods are typically going to be used to draw something on the screen, which is true in this case, or perhaps even to print something. Remember, printing and returning are two separate actions. Might talk about that a little bit later on in the video. Yeah, whenever you have a method that with a return type of void, you have to visually inspect the output to make sure that it's behaving properly, which is what we did with the debug app here. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. We're going to take a look at ArraySum next, which is not this method, but this one right here, ArraySum. We are looking at this method, and I can see that it takes in an array as a parameter and returns an integer where that integer is supposed to be the sum of the elements. So we actually need to go ahead and compute that. Let's go ahead and start doing this. We've actually done this before, I think maybe even in class. So sum's already started at 0 for us. We can just go ahead and use a for loop here. You could even do a for each loop here. For each integer value v in the array that's called values, we're going to add that to our sum variable. And then once we get down to the bottom, we'll just return the sum that we've computed. I think that's it. I think this little for loop is all you actually needed to add to this code to get it to work properly. But like we saw with the first method, we have some tests that we can use to check and make sure this works. So let's try that now and see. Substitute all, whatever. We didn't do that one. We're looking at ArraySum. So here's ArraySum, and we can see that of the tests that were given, all of them have passed. And you can see that there's actually a lot more of them here that it's using to check our work, and it's still all passed. So that code worked properly, which is great. Glad to see that. Okay. We're cruising right along here. We're going to complete the next method, which is called filled array. So if I go back here, scroll down a little bit, we see that this method has an interesting return type. So any type we've seen so far is an acceptable return type. So arrays are no exception. We can use arrays here. So how does this method work? It wants us to create an array that has this length, and it wants us to fill every single spot in that array with this value. So if the length is 3 and the value is 7, I want my array to say 777. If the length is 10 and the value is 2, then I want my array to have 10 2s in it by the time this is done. So let's go ahead and start coding that up. You can see that we've kind of given you a little bit of a head start here, but we actually need to create an array of the appropriate size, as the comment says. So we'll go ahead and do that by saying new integer array, and we can just plug in the length. Once that's done, we're going to write a for loop again. This time, a for each loop would not work. We actually have to use the index to set values into the array, so we have to do the loop using this style. We can just say length here if we want to. And we'll say values at position of I is equal to whatever this number is, which we are calling value. All right, and then the return statement, which says what our output is down here. Note though that this has to be an array, right? So let's just say for experimentation's sake, I change this to be 5. We now have a problem. 5 is an integer, but it is not an array. So when you have the return type specified as an integer array, it needs to match. It needs to be an entire array of things. It cannot just be a single value. So that's why we're using values, which is the name that we've given to our integer array, as our return value at this point. Let's go ahead and rerun these tests and see if they pass. Filled array looks like it doesn't pass, not everything. So let's go ahead and dive in and see if we can't figure out what the heck's going on. Looks like a lot of them do pass, and you can see that we try a lot of different tests here. These are all different values that are being plugged in and tested. Let's see what's going on with this one. If I take a look at this one, I see that we're checking, well, let's back up a second. This test is a little bit more complicated, so let's back up to the beginning. We're using a length of 2 and a value of 4, so the array should say 4, 4. We're creating this array, and this is how we call a method and store the return value into a variable. This is an important thing to know how to do, right? This is calling our filled array method with a length of 2 and a value of 4. This should give us the values of 4, 4. We're making sure that it's not empty, it's not null, and then we're checking to make sure that this value of 4 is equal to the length of the array. But actually, wait a second. That's not what should be equal to the length of the array. It should be this value, length. It should be length that's here. Here's an example of what we think the array should look like when it's done, and then it checks to make sure that those arrays are equal as well. Let's go ahead and rerun these tests now that I think I've fixed it. Yes, we can see that the filled array tests do now pass. So that's good. All right, we're going to keep going. We have a few more methods that we're going to do here. We're going to write these next ones from scratch. And the next method that we're going to use is called array mean. The nice thing about array mean is that we've already done the work for some of it, right? To take the average of the values in an array, we first have to take the sum, and then we have to divide by the total number. Well, we need to, instead of, we actually already have the code to take the sum of an array. You probably remember from just a few moments ago. We wrote this nice array sum method. But instead of, taking this code and copying it and moving it down here when we try to write our array mean method, what we're actually going to do instead is utilize that method by calling it. So let's go ahead and start this out. We're going to start with our magic words, public static. We can see that it accepts in an integer array. So and the return value should be, so I'm taking the average, should probably be does it want to double? Return the mean of integers, right? So it's a little bit unclear. I think double makes sense here though. Next is the name of the array, name of the method, followed by parentheses, and then the input parameters need to go within those parentheses. So we wish to accept an integer array called values, and this is the array that we want to take the average of, take the mean of. So as I was saying before, we have a method up here to compute the sum, and instead of just copying this code and pasting it down here, which would work, right? I don't want to do that. I want to use this code as it is written. And we can do that by calling this method. So in order to call a method, we're going to type the name of the method. And then if the method has any input parameters, we need to stick them inside the parentheses. This one does have input parameters. I'm going to take the parameter for my array mean method and just plug it right in here. That should compute the sum. Remember, however, that this is going to compute and then return a value for us. So we need to create a variable and store this return value that's being passed into this variable. Once that's done, we actually have a fairly simple, straightforward process of returning the sum divided by the length of the array. The only issue that I'm going to take care of here is actually I might switch this to be a double just to avoid any division problems that might occur. Division with 2 ints. You could also do this all in one line. The instructions hint that this is doable all in one line. And the reason why that's true is because we're calling our array sum method. Now I want to take a look at this in a couple of different ways. First, let's run the tests and make sure that the tests are running properly. And yeah, here we go. We see that array mean appears to be working properly. That's great. That's awesome. And so it also passes these filled array sum and mean tests down here. It looks like we're passing all the tests that we're expected to pass for today. However, I wanted to walk through this in another way as well. I wanted to set a breakpoint and show you exactly how this execution is working. So remember, these tests, all of these tests are actually calling the method. So like for this one here, we can see that it's calling the method or the array mean and then comparing that result. So we should be able to use the debugger to see how these methods work. It is a little bit confusing with the unit tests involved. You typically don't want to set your breakpoints in the unit tests, although you can do that. I prefer actually to set my breakpoints within the methods themselves. So I'm going to set a breakpoint here on line 111, and then I'm going to run the these tests again. I can pick one out in particular if I want to and click debug, which is not a bad idea. Whoops. Well, except it didn't work, right? Be better if it worked. Or maybe what I should do is just run the entire unit tests under the debugger. So I can do that by right-clicking and saying debug as JUnitTest, and hopefully this time it'll, yeah, there we go. So a lot of the tests don't worry about array mean, and so those are just going to run normally. But once we get to the tests that are testing the array mean, then we can see that we hit our breakpoint on line 111. Let's take a look at the array that's been plugged in. There's only one value in it, which is 42. I don't really care about that so much as the execution. What is this line saying? It's saying first we need to compute the sum. And in order to do that, we need to jump to the array sum method. So over here's our execution stack. I know it looks very complicated with all this stuff down here, but really the only one that matters to us is on the top. We're currently in the method called array mean. If I click step into, that means I'm going to jump into the method that's being called. And now look, the top of the stack says that we're in the array sum method. So the array sum is going to do its thing. There's only one value in the array, so it's a pretty trivial trip through that loop to compute the sum. We've now hit the return statement. Remember, the return statement does two things. It says that this is our answer, so 42 is our answer. It also says this method is done, and we need to go back to wherever we were called. We need to literally return to wherever we were called. How does it know where to return to? Well, this is the method that I'm in now. This is the one that was in before, so this is where I'm going to return to, line 111. So if I go ahead and I keep stepping over, you'll see that that's where we are. We're at 111. We can see that array sum returned a value of 42, and as soon as I click this button again, we're going to get that value stored inside of the variable called sum. And then finally, it's going to compute the actual mean. And if we look, we can, well, it actually doesn't show us the result because we're back in unit test land. But if you want to get back to your breakpoint, you can actually click this resume button. And we can see that we're now back at our original breakpoint. We are running another test. So we're running another test. This time the values are 10 and 20. That average should be 15, right? One quick side note. I mentioned earlier that we click step into to jump into a method call. If you don't want to jump into a method call, you can use step over. So notice that if I click step over here, it still runs the method, but it doesn't go into that method and show me the execution line by line. It just does it. Here's my sum of 30. And so this is a nice tool to be able to use. You don't necessarily need to step into every single method. If you didn't write the method, you probably don't want to step into it. If you did write the method, but you're pretty confident that the method is functioning properly, then you don't necessarily need to step into it. I step into methods that I suspect might be causing the problem, and I step over methods that I suspect aren't causing any problems for me. So that's just a nice little tip to keep in mind as you're debugging. All right, let me stop the debugger here and return to our task at hand. I believe that's going to finish up that method. We're going to finish up this by talking about comments a little bit. So One thing that we like to do as programmers is tell other people how to use our methods. And the way that we do that is by leaving these comments that are called Javadoc comments. And so you can see that for the methods that are here, we've already included the Javadoc comments. These actually are really nice for us. Let me show you how you can do this yourself. We're actually going to ask you to do this on future assignments, so this is something that you'll need to know how to do. You can start a Javadoc comment by going above the method and typing /*, and then when you hit enter, it's gonna take a look at your method and generate this for you automatically, and then you just kind of have to fill in the blanks. The first one should be just a brief description of what this method is doing. It takes in an array and returns the average. So this should just be a brief description of what the method does. This should be a brief description of what the parameter is, the array to be averaged. And then this should be a brief description of what the return value is. This is what's known as a Javadoc comment. And we're leaving these not for ourselves necessarily, but mostly for other programmers who we suspect may eventually look at this code or even use this code themselves. And let me show you a nice thing about these Javadoc comments. Actually, Eclipse has a nice little feature. You can go into, let's see, is it in source? Where do I generate the Javadoc comment? Project, yeah, it's in the project menu. There's an option called Generate Javadoc. And if I do that and I select the Studio 5 project, which is what we're working on, it's going to ask me where it wants to put it. I don't really care. We'll just go ahead and click finish and say yes, and then it's building all these comments. Yes, we got a bunch of warnings, whatever, I'm not too worried about that. But down here in the studio, we can see there's now a folder called doc, and inside of this folder we can see that there's a whole bunch of HTML files. That's a website. So it actually took these comments and generated them into a website. And if I open this up in a browser, I can show you what this actually looks like. Right? It shows me a description of all the stuff that's in this project. And if I go into where the code actually is in this methods file, we can see that it has a list of all the methods, and then boom, right here, right at the very top is our method that we wrote the comments for. It says takes in an array and returns the average. That is exactly what we wrote in our Javadoc comments, right? And furthermore, we can explore a little bit more. If I click on this, it takes me down to a description where you can see the parameters are defined, right? These are also from the Javadoc comments. Those are exactly from the Javadoc comments. Furthermore, I think it's important to notice that this is the same thing that we see when we Google Java stuff online. So if I go and I say, Java string, for example, and I take a look at the official Oracle documentation for strings, it looks exactly the same. In fact, built into Java are these methods with Javadoc comments, and that's what's used to produce the official Oracle documentation. So it's just kind of a standard that Java developers use to share their work with other programmers, to share documentation, instructions about how to use their code with other programmers. So we thought that was an important thing to show you. Writing Javadoc comments is an important thing to know how to do, and we're going to ask you to do that on future homework assignments. All right, I think that's going to do it for this studio. I believe I have covered everything. Yeah, I did. I covered everything. So yes, the next assignment is the first of a two-part assignment involving zombies. So you're going to be running a little zombie simulation where they try to chase down the humans and turn them into zombies. It's a really fun assignment, but also one of the trickier ones. I definitely would encourage you to get started on it sooner rather than later, so that you have plenty of time to get help if and when you need it. That's going to do it for now, though. I hope this was a good studio review for you, and I hope you all have a great weekend. I will see you back in class next week.